Today's talk is given by the backgammon champion of the UK, Jason. Jason's a bit like a Tuareg nomad. He has started doing biology somewhere around, and he's been to Oxford, and now he comes to Cambridge. I actually sort of did the silly thing of going to your file, and your PhD topic was supposed to be on the Libya in 1942 to 51 or something. Time slips, as far as I can see. But Jason's going to give us a talk about Libya, so I need do nothing more than say thank you, Jason.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Philip, as always, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at the CATS grad seminar, talking to an audience of my peers. I always enjoy giving these general audience talks because I believe the study of contemporary Libyan history is not only of merit for policymakers and businessmen, but of considerable intellectual and scholarly merit. Philip is right to point out that my doctorate is about 1940s Libya. I think that has scholarly merit as well, but I always want to talk about what's going on in Libya now because there's a lot of misperceptions in the media, and I feel that maybe you'd be interested to have more of a first-hand account of it. So why is Libya so interesting? I think this is because the country, both before and post-Gaddafi, is terribly under-researched, but it's also full of contradictions, and studying it sheds light on many fascinating conundrums that exist in the broader social and historical sciences. Let's consider, for example, what happens when a society is governed by a state, and then that state collapses. How does that affect the society? How do primordial social organizations like tribes or local governance structures reassert themselves into that vacuum? Can some societies function without governance institutions? So to illustrate these many dynamics, I'd like to start with a quick recap of the exciting events of the last years and months in Libya. And I hope to give you a granular picture of not only the evolution of the situation on the ground, but what the different fissures are in Libyan society. And to give a little local character, I'll talk about some experiences I had when I was in Libya 3 months ago, all the while addressing the focal point of this talk, what I think is the main intellectual question that the current situation in Libya raises to a researcher who wishes, as I do, to place post-Gaddafi developments within their larger historical context. Namely, why does Libya, an ethnically, religiously, economically, and socially fairly homogeneous society, have so many social fissures, while neighboring societies like Egypt or Tunisia, with arguably more religious, educational, and economic disparities, manifest fewer social fissures? Why is Libya epitomized by sub-state groupings which are stronger than the central government? And why are these sub-state groupings, the militias and the local councils and the tribes, so much more successful than the central government at garnering the loyalty and appealing to Libyans? Okay, before trying to unveil these complex questions, I know I'm addressing a general audience, so let me set the scene for what's going on in today's Libya. You no doubt all know, with the success of the Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia and then in Egypt, there was not a copycat uprising, but an authentic, genuinely Libyan uprising that began in February of 2011. It was unable to succeed on its own after about a month. It was important for Western, but also Arab and NATO forces to intervene with a no-fly zone on behalf of the rebels. Shortly thereafter, a good 6 months of back-and-forth struggle, the Libyan uprisings and the forces of these NATO jets toppled Muammar Gaddafi. Initially, this was the cause of great celebrations in the country, optimism, and although people were frustrated with maybe the role of outside powers to a minor extent, but to a much greater extent, the role of the militias in their own communities, or what that was seen as a weak and distant political leadership, looking at Libya from just after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, when I was there 2 years and a little bit ago, pretty much everyone was willing to give the benefit of the doubt to these different forces. You know, let's help the leadership, the militias and outside powers work together to build a new country. And yet, 2 years on, at the anniversary, the second anniversary of the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, you could barely even sense the lukewarm celebrations because there are violent clashes between Libyans in Tripoli and Benghazi, where there are pockets of stability and peace. People are tired with their elected leaders. They feel that the constitutional process has never really taken off. So, how did we get to this place? Immediately after the revolution, Libya witnessed what could be determined, objectively as a wave of successes, both economic and democratic successes. But then, since about midway through 2012, there's been an equally rapid string of disappointments. The most important successes were pre-war levels of oil production were very quickly restored. And this was not imagined possible. But yet, despite how quickly Libya's oil went from 1.6 million barrels a day before the uprising, then to about 0.4 or 0.3 million barrels during the uprising, it skyrocketed back to 1.4, 1.6. And amazingly, nothing was achieved from there. Oil exports and therefore income stagnated in early 2013. This seems to be due to a lack of Libyan know-how, an inability to attract foreign direct investment, and then most importantly, the horrible security situation, which makes further investment and bringing in of technical expertise impossible. But even with oil production stagnating, we're still talking about a very wealthy country with the ability to make investments. What happened and has shocked all of us Libya watchers is that all of a sudden production was brought to a standstill by a wave of oil strikes this summer, which has brought production to about 10% of its mid-2012 levels. So, to talk about a trajectory from successes to failures, the election for the General National Congress in July of 2012 has to objectively be considered an amazing success. Over 80% of registered Libyans voted. Violence was minimal. The victorious party was a liberal, pro-economic development, pro-globalization party, seemed to be staffed by competent technocrats. Yet no sooner did they attempt to form a governing coalition than infighting within the party, within the independents, torpedoed the first Prime Minister-elect, my friend Mustafa Abu Shagur, his attempts to form a cabinet. And just as there was this cabinet crisis, we all know about the events of September 2012 in Libya, where, of course, the American ambassador, Chris Stevens, was killed in Benghazi. And that's really been a turning point for the country. One might have hoped it could have been a turning point to rally Libyans against the Islamists and the militias. That wasn't what ended up shaking out. Rather, when the current Prime Minister, Ali Zidane, came to power in November, it appeared that all of the authority that he might have had in his office had been dissipated. Since that point, the General National Congress is barely able to secure its own premises. It's quite frequent for different groups to storm the Congress building and say, we want more pensions, or we think that the fighters should be sent abroad for medical treatment. And they hold the parliament hostage at gunpoint until they vote that legislation. The most extreme case of this kind of politics at gunpoint is the political isolation law that you may be aware of. This was something that had been debated as a kind of de-Baathification style measure in Libya, i.e. people who had served in the Gaddafi regime would not be able to run for higher office. But rather than a debate happening in the Congress, of course, various militias spearheaded by Misrata and some connections with the Islamists forced the Congress to vote in an extreme version of the political isolation law, which caused many functionaries who had, say, served the Gaddafi regime in the 1980s, but then had been dissidents for 30 years, to have to resign from office. You could imagine this kind of law means the very skilled water minister, who happened to have been the water minister under Gaddafi and is the only guy who knows how to make the water pipelines work, well, he was forced to resign because the militias jammed this law down the throats of the Congress. Now, 2 weekends ago, something that might have deviated from this negative trend line happened. The citizens of Tripoli finally marched on the headquarters of one of the most unpopular militias. This is one of the most powerful militias in Libya, the Misratans. And they've been, of course, involved in smuggling and thuggery and aligned with extremists. And what did the militia do as a citizen protest came unarmed, asking them to get out of the town? Well, unsurprisingly, they fired an anti-aircraft gun into the crowd, killing about 40 people. The popular outcry has still not died down, and you could say this was a game changer in Libya. For the first time since the uprising, the militias have been genuinely chased out of the capital. People are not standing for it anymore. And an interesting dimension has happened, which is militias not involved in this tragedy are also leaving the capital. For example, Berber militias, who are the enemies of the Misratans, have said, uh-oh, maybe the tide is turning against the militias, and they have also left the capital. However, I can't say I'm optimistic. Because if the impasse is going to be broken and the constitutional process is going to be restored, this is going to need more than popular mobilization. It's going to need government action to build competent institutions. And yet, the idea that Ali Zidane, the prime minister, would be able to all of a sudden ride this wave of popular outrage and build these institutions and reform the security sector seems absurd, because he can't even secure his own office. And from what I hear inside the ministries, he wants to be paying people to guard the oil sites in the east, but he doesn't even have a mechanism to write checks to get them paid. So there are billions of dollars sitting in the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Europe, but there's no mechanism to pay people to guard the oil installations. So that might make me a little bit skeptical that they're going to be able to build the institutions that are needed. In fact, so long as the central authority remains as weak as the picture that I'm painting, then any relatively small group of armed men can extract whatever concessions they desire from the country, or threaten the economy by cutting off an oil pipeline or blocking the water to Tripoli. So, you might wonder, why would anyone want to do that when blocking the water or cutting off the oil obviously harms all Libyans equally? And to understand that, we need to get to this question. What are the major cleavages in Libya? And these cleavages are, roughly put, the Federalists in the east, in Cyrenaica, Berbers in the northwest, militias everywhere, and then Salafi, jihadi, Islamists embedded not only in the society but in the government. And you could even say that the defense ministry has become occupied almost exclusively by radical jihadis. And they are using that to paralyze the ability to build a national army and a coherent security infrastructure. So, sounds pretty dismal. Yet, the Libyan society is strong. Libyans don't want to kill each other. They don't have a history of civil war like, say, Lebanon or Iraq. They don't have sectarian cleavages. And the joke when you talk to Libyans, you know, how do you think things are going in their society? I always hear, maybe they all learn this joke from each other, they say, if there were this many rocket launchers on the streets in Cairo or Damascus, just imagine what people would get up to there. But here in Libya, you know, we have tribes, we're conservative, we trust each other. That's why it's relatively peaceful. In fact, most of the crime in Libya, or the violence, is not politically motivated. It's mass criminality. Hijackings of people to ransom their cars. And this is the reason when I'm in Libya, I don't take any kind of armored escort. I take a black cab or a hitchhike, and you're perfectly safe in this manner. It's only the Western security firms that counsel, you know, 4x4 GNCs with, you know, an armed ex-Marine commando guarding you. Well, that's an invitation to get hijacked by the militiamen who want that armored car. More serious than the rise of mass criminality is, of course, the economic crisis engendered by the stopping of the oil flow that I've mentioned. And yet, as this is reported in the Western media, what doesn't come out is that a consumer goods explosion, you could say, is happening in Libya. There's a burgeoning private sector. All the money that people had in banks abroad, they released after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. And every sort of consumer good is flooding into the country now that tariffs are abandoned and abolished. So why can't the vibrant civil society in Libya and the burgeoning private sector fill the vacuum that I've described? This has to do with my unique thesis that I mentioned in my book, which is that What happened in Libya is not a unified revolution, but a series of disconnected and ill-coordinated uprisings caused by the specific social, economic, tribal, and religious and ethnic forces at play in the country. In overthrowing Gaddafi, the scattered rebel militias of what I term the periphery overthrew not just the center of power, but they overthrew any institutional framework without having an idea of how they would create a new one to replace what was dislodged. This begs the question if in Libya, the weak center and the powerful periphery is the product of a Western intervention or standard post-conflict scenario, or is this rooted in Libya's unique version of statelessness that it has had throughout its entire 20th century history? I think that that's the answer, and seeking to find this out, I've always investigated Libya's colonial and post-colonial history, looking for the answers to this institutional vacuum. Why have attempts at modernization and centralization and bureaucratization in an oil state like Libya not taken the trajectory that they might have in, say, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, where oil has been used to build strong institutions? To be super brief, I find the answer in the historical context. The Ottoman reforms of the 19th century, which many of you may know, the Tanzimat, they came very late to Libya, and Tripoli was never able to control its hinterland. So notables outside of the capital refused to pay taxes, tribesmen refused to be conscripted. Then in the Italian period, fascist colonialism was quite different than French or British models. They didn't really build institutions or schools, rather they destroyed and atomized Libya's tribal society. The British